While Europe's eye is fixed on mighty things, the fate of empires and the fall of kings, while quacks of state must each produce his plan, and even children lisp the rights of man. Amid this mighty fuss, just let me mention, the rights of women merit some attention. And with that, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show and to a special programme on Scotland's national bard. This is Robert Burns' season, and from Moscow to Michigan, from Cape Horn to Cape Hope, from Newfoundland to New Zealand, devotees of Burns and lovers of Scotland gather to celebrate his life and work. This year, like last, some of the Burns suppers are virtual, but many will once again assume that special social collection of speeches, music, recitations and clatter that make the celebrations of Burns unique. All great Burns speeches, immortal memories they are called, have a theme, and our programme today is no exception. We look at Burns and radical political thought. Alex is joined by top Burnsian and author of Scots the Mither Tongue, Billy Kay, to explain a little of why Burns' Supper is a very special occasion and of some of the great historical figures who have fallen under the poet's spell. We then speak to a former MP for Burns Country in Ayrshire, Jim Sillars, a firebrand politician for First Labour and then the SNP, for his view on the impact of Burns on radical politics in Scotland and internationally. But first, to your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week with Colonel Wilkerson, discussing whether the late General Colin Powell was the best president America never had, and revealed his knowledge of how former Prime Minister Sir Tony Blair prior committed Britain to stand with President Bush in the Iraq War, come what may. Now, Danny says in terms of great presidents America never had, I'd say Bernie Sanders too, although he'd probably likely be anathema to most with means. The underprivileged Trump base would hopefully come to realise the purpose of politics and government. John Bissett says in terms of the stormings of the Capitol, they're right up there with the weapons of mass destruction stage political theatre to keep the masses distracted. Fiona McClay says in relation to Colin Powell, he lied about weapons of mass destruction, lost all respect for him when he did that. I wonder if he ever regretted saying it. To which Christopher responds, yes, he publicly admitted his regret for this. Steve Robertson says the best president the USA never had was Bobby Kennedy. William Thorburn says Bernie Sanders would have made a huge difference to the USA. And finally, Gervais Warren says we know that Tony is still fighting unsuccessfully to save his reputation. Now, when the Scottish Parliament reconvened in 1999, the newly elected parliamentarians were joined by the aristocracy of Scotland and royalty, assembled suitably berobed to celebrate the occasion. But the highlight of the day was something quite different. It was Scots singer Sheena Wellington performing the Burns anthem of universal equality and the brotherhood of man. Let's take a look.
What though on himly fair we dine, we're hard and grey, and all that, gie fools their silks and knaves their wine, a man's a man for all that.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the first of our braw lads from Ayrshire, Burns Country, Billy Kay, Scots language campaigner, broadcaster. Billy, you must have, when you watched that opening of the Scots Parliament, we just seen with Sheena Wellington singing A Man's a Man, it must have given you a bit of a surge of enthusiasm to see the Scots language and Burns injected into the ceremony.
It was wonderful, and Sheena's singing was wonderful, and the fact that everyone joined in and knew the words was fantastic. But it should have been the most natural thing in the world for Scots to be at the centre of the Scottish Parliament. That's the language that's expressed for the majority of the population, their culture, their history, their poetry for many centuries. It's a wonderful choice of song. A radical song that goes back to the 1790s when Burns was very aware that people were being sent to Botany Bay for radical opinions at that time, Muir of Hunters Hill, but he persisted and wrote radical songs. Sometimes they were only published anonymously in newspapers, sometimes they weren't published until after he died, they were so revolutionary. But he managed to survive. So he was as radical as he could be in that period. And I think it's important to remember that. This was a period when 20 years later, during the Friends of the People, the planting of the Tree of Liberty in the 1790s, a few decades later, you had the 1820 Weavers' Revolt, when the weavers again were for radical reform. And 3 of the weavers were hung for treason in Stirling, Bayard Hardy, etc. So this was a period of extreme suppression where Burns had to watch his back, or he could be in deep, deep trouble, or could even be tried for treason like the men in the 1790s.
And how aware were the Friends of the People campaigners that they had an ally in Burns? I mean, you know, was Burns on their placards in 1820? You know, a quarter of a century after Burns' death, were they, you know, chanting Burns' lyrics as well as carrying banners saying "Scotland free as a desert"? How much was Burns part of the radical movement?
He became quickly part of it after his death. So by 1820, definitely. 1790s, he was a popular poet, but because he had to keep his radicalism comparatively secret. Having said that, he was purported as having sung the French Revolutionary song Ça ira in the Globe in Dumfries, when he also got an actress to read out the rights of women, which is a beautiful statement, radical statement for its period. While Europe's eye is fixed on mighty things, the fate of empires and the fall of kings, while quacks of state must each produce his plan, and even children lisp the rights of man. Amidst this mighty fuss, just let me mention, the rights of women merit some attention.
So Scots Wi Hay is a very clever poem and song, of course, in the sense that ostensibly this is Robert the Bruce, the hero king of Scotland, addressing his army on the eve of the Battle of Bannockburn. But in reality, there are phrases in it which echo the cries of the Friends of the People, you know, liberty in every blow, this sort of stuff. And Burns, you reckon, was consciously writing this as a rallying call for radicalism.
There's a lovely quotation by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American writer. The Confessions of Augsburg, the Declaration of Independence, the Rights of Man, La Marseillaise, are not more weighty documents in the history of freedom than the songs of Burns. So that, for example, that's not hyperbole, that's true. When Texas rose up against its Mexican overlords, the proclamations had the words, "Now's the day and now's the hour," which Burns took from Blin Harry's Wallace, going back to the 14th and 15th century. So it's a radical statement going back very, very, very many centuries. Burns himself said that the story of Wallace poured a Scottish prejudice in my veins, which will boil along there till the floodgates of life shut in eternal rest. And again, that was almost treasonable at that time.
So let's look at the defenders of the Alamo. I mean, this story that they were singing Tum Tati, isn't it? The music of Scots Way. Is this true? I mean, I didn't see that in the John Wayne film. I mean, were they really Scottish nationalists defending the walls of the Alamo?
Well, there were a number of Scots at the Alamo, and they would have been aware of Burns, certainly. But that's a fascinating story of Scots Wi Hay. The tune is a pipe tune that goes back to the days of Robert the Bruce, and it was used at the Siege of Orleans by the Garde Écossais du Corps du Roi, the personal bodyguard of the French kings, and Joan of Arc when they liberated the city of Orleans during the Auld Alliance. And to this day, that tune, Scots Wi Hay, is a French military march, and it's called Le Marche des Soldats de Robert Bruce, or the marche qui a été jouée pour l'entrée triomphale de Jean la Pucelle à Orléans, the march played on the occasion of Joan of Arc's triumphal entry into Orléans. So it's a French military march. You can hear it in Berlioz's Rob Roy, and later Burns chose that tune because of its great association to write the words of Scots Wi Hay to.
So we're linking Bannockburn, Joan of Arc, the Alamo, and these resonances through history. Burns, I mean, when he was capturing these songs and setting them to words, like in Scots Wi Hay, I mean, again, was this a deliberate act, or was, you know, the poet just saying, well, that's quite a suitable tune for my sentiments? You know, how much was Burns consciously combining these things? How much was the hidden hand of Burns behind these apparently historical accidents?
He was a highly educated man for his period, and he was steeped in Scottish tradition and Scottish folklore. For example, when he wrote Auld Lang Syne, one of the versions he collected was from southern Spain going back a couple of centuries, and it was, "For Auld Lang Syne, my Jo, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll tak a walk to Malaga for Auld Lang Syne," referring to Malaga wine going back to the 16th century. So he was very, very conscious. Because of that too, I think the echoes that he had down through the ages and down through into other countries is fascinating, where you have people like J.D. Salinger in America with his novel Catcher in the Rye, based on a Burns song. You've got Steinbeck of Mice and Men, the title based on the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee. So he was someone who penetrated the life of the people. In America, for example, Abraham Lincoln could quote screeds of Burns off by heart that he got from a Scottish friend of his. And he once memorably said that he wouldn't do the immortal memory in Chicago because he could add nothing to the eloquence of Robert Burns. And that's from one of the great orators in world history. And then the other political extreme, you've got Russia. Now, the popularity of Burns during the Soviet period is quite obvious, and he was promoted for his radical ideas. But his popularity goes back further than that. Lermontov translated some Burns. Pushkin translated the Scottish ballads. So there was an interest in Scots and Scottish culture. And it was a man called Samuel Marshak who translated Burns brilliantly that made him very, very popular in Russia. So much so that the first country ever to create a stamp of Burns was the Soviet Union in 1957.
So would we say that Burns is lauded from Moscow to Michigan? We're not exaggerating. And so how do you think Robert Burns might, in this troubled world, provide points of unity in these times?
Well, I think we as Scots and global citizens should be reminding ourselves of his international brotherhood, and especially of Scots Wahey, that it really is time for that democracy to return to Scotland and for us to go for the independence that I'm sure he supported with the depths of his soul back in the 1790s. So I think these are important commemorations that we should remember Robert Burns for today.
And finally, Billy Kay, a man of many Burns suppers and many locations, do you have a favourite quotation or a favourite incident that you'd like to tell our international audience about the world's poet?
Well, I recall I spent a year travelling around the world, and one of the most bizarre Burns suppers was in Malaya, in the island of Penang, in a fisherman's hut, where my pal and I from Kilmarnock had half a bottle of malt whiskey that we brought off the plane when we left Scotland, and we drank that, and I recited Tam O'Shanter, and he sung Ye Fond Kiss, and we had an Australian victim. We just sat an Australian in the corner and gave him a Burns supper with 2 Ayrshire lads. But coming back to A Man's a Man for All That, you just can't get better than the final verse of A Man's a Man for All That. Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will for all that sense and worth our all the earth shall bear the gree and all that. For all that and all that it's coming yet for all that man to man, the world our, shall brothers be for all that.
So, Billy Kay, we started with the rights of women and we've finished with the brotherhood of man. Thank you so much for joining me in the Alex Salmond Show in this Burns season.
All the best, all the best.
Join us after the break, when Alex is joined by the former MP for Burns Country in South Ayrshire, Jim Sillars. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Now, in our special celebration of the life and works of Scotland's national bard Robert Burns, we're examining the impact of Burns on radical political thought. Alex speaks to former Labour and SNP MP Jim Sillars.
And now we come to the second of our braw lads from Ayrshire, Jim Sillars, obviously the victor of the famous Govan by-election in the late 1980s, but before that, a Labour MP for South Ayrshire. Now, I'm quite interested, Jim Sillars, in the 70s as a Labour MP for South Ayrshire, were you kind of like the custodian of the political Burdens tradition? Were you the MP people said, right, we're having a Burdens supper, so let's get the MP for South Ayrshire in?
No, I don't think I personally, as the MP for South Ayrshire, was the custodian. In fact, the custodian was John Pollock, a major figure in the Ayrshire socialist movement and indeed in the Scottish socialist movement. But as MP for South Ayrshire, I didn't become MP for South Ayrshire, parachuted in. I was born in Ayr. I'm an Ayrshire person, and Ayrshire is steeped in Robert Burns. And the importance of the MP for South Ayrshire, the MP for South Ayrshire and the MP for Ayr were automatically trustees of Burns Cottage, where Burns was born, right up until fairly recent times. And that was a responsibility that I took seriously. And to be fair, George Younger, who was the Tory MP for Ayr, took seriously as well. We attended every meeting and made our contribution to maintaining the Burns Cottage and the Burns Monument, which are extremely important in the cultural life of my home county. In fact, if I'm a nationalist at all, I'm an Ayrshire nationalist, and that's because of Burns.
So that must have been quite interesting. When George Younger, Secretary of State for Scotland, a Conservative icon in Scotland, and yourself as a firebrand, Labour Member of Parliament. Did you have any political tussles about Burns? Were you flinging quotations at each other, or did you just get on with the business of making sure the Alloway Cottage was being properly preserved and presented? To some people will seem very strange, but Tories in Scotland can embrace Burns as well as socialists like me. Now, I've got a number of socialist friends who think this is a great puzzle, but of course, Burns was a man of many parts as well. And it's perfectly possible, if you're a Tory, not to buy into some of the things that he said, but nevertheless buy into other things that he said. And also, of course, leaving aside, just for the second, his political philosophy. The man was a genius as a poet and in songwriting and in storytelling, such as Tam O'Shanter. So it's quite easy for a Tory to buy into Burns the same it is for somebody on the left. So that takes us right into Burns's political impact in Scotland. Now, over the last 2 centuries in Mayor, Burns has been claimed successively for the Empire, then for the Labour movement in Scotland, and then for the Scottish nationalist in Scotland. Is that because Burns is this man of parts, or is it because that we've learned more about the messages behind Burns's poetry?
From the Reformation on, there were great strands in Scottish society punting the idea of egalitarianism. What Burns did was he brought all these strands together, in my view, and created a doctrine of egalitarianism. And if you look at the poem, Man Was Made to Mourn, when he says, and I'm just going to quote it, "Were I designed on yon lordling slave, by nature's law designed, why was an independent wish ere planted in my mind?" And of course, there are other poems where it's pretty clear, as David Dicey said when introducing a major works of Burns, that he was a rebel against the social order that exists at that time. But it's this consolidation of all those strands of egalitarianism that had made Burns command and continue to command the Scottish psyche.
But you have sympathy with, Hugh McDermott, the towering Scots poet of the 20th century. He was pretty waspish about Burns' suppers. attacking the suppers where the privileged gathered together, had an evening of Burns songs and radicalism, and then went off to exploit the workers as they did for the other 364 days of the year. Do you have any sympathy with McDermott's condemnation?
Now, I know that, that McDermott was quite right. Others went along, high Tories, or have a Burns supper, and then go and exploit the worker. I never experienced that in my part of Ayrshire.
And how about the other contradiction like the Burns supper, that many Burns suppers are male only? Now, I think we can agree that if Robert Burns had been organising a Burns supper, there would be no chance whatsoever that it would have been men only.
Yes. I noticed in one of the papers this week that the feminist movement has been urged to have a go at Burns for his misogynist ideas and practices. And Rabbi Burns was not a paragon of virtue. I mean, the Burns suppers that I've attended and spoken at, it's been made very clear, that Burns had virtues and Burns had vices. And anybody who wants to go have a go at Robert Burns to tear down his statues and all the rest of it, I would advise them to read the epitaph. Now I'll read it to you. Is there a man whose judgment clear can others teach the course to steer, yet runs himself life's mad career, wild as the wave? Here pause, and though through a starting tear, attend the grave. Wild as the wave, that's Robert Burns with all his contradictions, and yet that man had a social and political philosophy that's as relevant today and forms opinions today and keeps opinions today in Scotland as though he was talking yesterday.
And finally, Jim Sillars, let's cast Burns internationally and tell, how would you assess Burns' impact as a romantic poet, but his impact on political thinking in the world hour?
People have got to bear in mind that Burns was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. I mean, he didn't stand apart from it. He was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. And I was recently reading a book on the founding fathers of the United States Constitution. The great big debate over the Federalist Papers, which involved Hamilton, Madison, and someone else, for whose name at the moment I forget. But Madison is called the father of the US Constitution. And the Scottish Enlightenment wasn't just the Enlightenment, it was the Scottish Enlightenment, which had the greatest influence on them, and that included the works of Robert Burns. Of course, there's a contradiction there. How could you imbibe the egalitarianism of Robert Burns if you're James Madison while being a slave owner at the same time? This is one of these contradictions in history that's very, very difficult for our generation to come to terms with. But Burns had an enormous influence. And later on, I think one of the greatest influence he had was on Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, Mrs. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln intended, after he demitted the presidency, to come to Ayrshire and visit Burns Cottage. Mrs. Lincoln managed it, and of course, Abe Lincoln couldn't manage it.
So, Jim Sillars, from all the Burns suppers, from all the Burns collections and poetry and songs, do you have a very favourite of your own?
Yes. It's on a national victory, where it would be celebrated. And Burns' retort was, "Ye hypocrites, are these your pranks, to murder men and gie God thanks? Desist for shame, proceed nae further. God will nae gie ye thanks for murder."
So Jim Sillars, Burnsian, Brawlad, with these words, which are opposite today as they were 200 years ago in May. Thank you so much for joining me again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Well, I'm very glad to be here, Alec. And I look forward to the day when you and I stand in the steps of the Scottish Parliament, and if it's no Sheena herself, somebody else sings that song that opened the Scottish Parliament in 1999, this time for independence.
Jim Sillars, thank you again.
Given that Bob Dylan has cited Robert Burns in general, and My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose in particular, as his major artistic inspiration, the Scots bard's status as a romantic poet is beyond question. However, it was not his love poetry that kept Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, or more recently, civil rights activist Maya Angelou, steadfast on their course, or saw Burns's face on Soviet stamps, or inspired Steinbeck to describe the struggles of the common man. It was Burns's position which Liam McIlvanney has described as the poet laureate of the radical Enlightenment. And it was Burns as a poetic champion of liberty and equality which has captured the radical imagination for 100 years and more, and established Robert Burns as a friend of the people. Or as the poet himself put it, the rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gowd for all that. And what better way to play us out than Scottish singer Ryan Burns performing one of his namesake's most iconic songs.
Is there for all this poverty that hangs his head and all that the coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that and all that, our toils obscure and all that, the rank is but the guinea stamp, a man's the guide for all that. But though on him fair we dine, we're hard and grey and all that, he fills their silks and leaves their wine, a man's a man for all that.